Welcome to the Everyday Discernment podcast. I'm back today and I have Jason Romano with me. He's an author, speaker, media professional with over 20 years of broadcasting experience. And I'm excited that he's on the program today. So Jason, welcome.
Good to be with you, Tim. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for being on. How's 2020 treating you so far?
It's just like any other year, right?
Right? Nothing to speak of. Nothing crazy going on.
It's been an interesting year. There's a lot of lessons I think within it, but it's one of those years where you wish you never went through it. But I think a lot of times, like anything in life, when we're going through valleys or difficult moments, we don't want to go through them. But I think we'll all be better because we went through them, and that's what I'm hoping. When we get to next year or the year after, we can look back and say, yeah, this really wasn't fun and it kind of stunk, but we're better for it. So
yeah, amen. Hopefully that's what we can all say.
Yeah.
Cool. So just tell us quickly about yourself, personal information and anything else you want to share.
Sure. So I am a husband and a dad, and I work for a company called Sports Spectrum, where I host a show called the Sports Spectrum podcast, and we're also a radio show and interview athletes and coaches and other people in the world of sports and intersect the conversation with faith and talk about walks with Christ and different journeys for different people as they strive to follow the Lord. So that is the role that I have. And I grew up in Albany, New York, moved out to Connecticut 20 years ago for a job that I worked at ESPN for 17 years. Left ESPN 3.5 years ago and have been doing what I said with Sports Spectrum since then. Also wrote 2 books in the last 3 years or 2 years, I guess, on different topics. One was on forgiveness, the other one on leadership, and the latest one on leadership released a couple months ago. So it's been a fun journey, and here we are in 2020, just riding the wave.
Just hanging out. Yeah.
That's it, man.
That's impressive. 2 books in 2 years. I wrote a book and it's if you've never written a book before, it's about as tough as you probably think it is, but it's also something that you can't just like whip up out of nowhere. It takes it's dedication
painful.
And commitment.
Tim, it's painful. And I would say it's actually 2 books in 3 years. The first book was January of 2018. This book released in July of 2020. So it's a 2-year process really for both books to get written. But even then, it's still a lot, and it's hard work, and it's some cases it's a labor of love, but it's also difficult. It's not easy to write books, and I'm grateful that the opportunities came. It's not my favorite thing to do, but my favorite thing to do is have them be done and let people read them and hopefully be encouraged by them. So
yeah, after I wrote my book, I'm like, never again. And then I'm like, well, unless God calls me to. And then you never want to tell God never.
Yeah, because he just laughs at us.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So how long have you been a Christian?
Christian now for 19 years, follower of Christ since Mother's Day of 2001. And prior to that, I was 27, so 19 years ago. Prior to that, I would call myself very nominally Catholic, but if I was being honest, I didn't care about God, didn't think about God. He wasn't really any part of my life. I probably would have told you I believed in God,
sure,
but the idea of relationship, salvation, the cross, any of that, I had no idea what it really truly was about. My brother was the first in our family to begin a journey with Christ, and my brother Chris. And it was 3 years later on Mother's Day of 2001 that he initially led me to the Lord and began the journey. I tell people when I said yes that day, I had no idea what I was saying yes to. I didn't fully understand it. I hadn't gone and got my master's and did my thesis on, salvation.
Yeah.
I just knew my heart was open that day, said yes, and began the journey, which honestly still continues today. I don't have it all figured out by any means.
Sure.
I would say I don't even have a master's or a thesis on biblical studies or anything like that, but I certainly have grown in my faith. And now it's been 19 years on this journey, and I'm not looking back. I'm continuing to press on.
That's a good reminder because that's why in discipleship is so important, and I'm passionate about that, is that, Christians that say yes and gives themselves to God, a lot of times they feel the expectations of the church to be perfect and to do all the things right and to have the convictions that sometimes come with years of experience and growing closer to God in our process and journey of sanctification. We have to have grace for people who are newer Christians and help them with the questions that they have, and come alongside them as they're running the race. And a lot of times they may feel, whether it's justified or not, shunned by the church, and we have to stand in the gap and make sure that they know, hey, it's okay if you have questions, and I'm going to come alongside you and help you.
I cannot agree more, and I have had experience with that. Not as much with me, although I had a lot of questions and I was curious, and I really spent that first year trying to learn what I had said yes to. And it took me about a year. And then I got plugged into a church, and a couple months later after that, got baptized and understood about salvation, still growing and learning more even to today. But I had someone close to me in my family say yes to God because they felt pressured and, almost to the point where it was forced upon them. And that person ended up really pushing church and Jesus away from them for a few years. Eventually they came to faith, thankfully, but that person was not happy with the witness, if you will, that someone had to them. They saw my brother, they saw me, but they didn't see it, Jesus, in the person that kind of cornered them to say yes to God, and saying yes out of obligation, walking away. And then that person looked at me and just said, what did I just do?
Yeah.
I can't believe that. I'm so mad, that happened, and really kind of pushed him away from faith for a few years. Thankfully, someone else came along who had a great sort of witness and representation of Christ by simply loving this person, and through loving them and just spending time with them, eventually invited them to church, and now they're walking with the Lord. But it was not easy, and I've seen it work in both ways. And it's so important when somebody says yes and begins the journey to really be, treat it like a newborn baby.
Yeah.
You really be careful with it, and you tend, being tender and caring and loving, and really be gentle and not be so forceful. I know we get excited, right? When somebody comes to faith, we're like, yes, let's get you plugged in a Bible study. Let's get you on men's group. Let's get you here. Let's get you there. And it's like, let me just breathe for a little while, and eventually I'll get plugged in.
Yeah.
So
That's a good word. That's great. Well, a couple icebreakers here. You were at ESPN a long time. I'm curious, who was the most interesting person you met? Not the most famous, but who were you most interested in talking with?
I like this question because there's a lot of interesting non-famous people that I met. He's kind of famous, so I'll say his name. You might recognize him. His name is Adam Richman. He is the Man versus Food guy. Did you ever watch that show?
I love that. I love that show.
Great show. And Adam came, it was right before the Super Bowl, I want to say maybe 10 or 11 years ago. And the idea was to bring Adam to ESPN. He was going to be on our show First Take, and kind of set up a spread of food and kind of cater your Super Bowl party or tailgate or whatever it was called. But getting to know him, he's an interesting guy, right? Like, so he loves sports. He loves his Yankees. He loves the Miami Dolphins. And so there's the unique connection, right? But he's a different guy in the sense of what he did. Like, he was, Man versus Food is him having like food competitions for an hour and trying to
with himself.
Yeah. And kind of putting himself through misery.
Yeah.
And getting to know him, though, he is just such a down-to-earth, great guy. Even to this day, we still have a fun relationship and say hello to each other on Twitter. And I haven't seen him in probably 6-7 years, but tremendous guy, nice guy, unique guy. Unfortunately, probably branded as the Man versus Food guy because his show was so big. But, he stopped doing like competitive eating like 6-7 years ago and has focused on other things. But just a really unique guy. Another answer I got for you is, and he's famous too, but probably hasn't been famous in a long time if you want to classify it that way, was MC Hammer, the rapper.
Oh, yeah.
He came about 10 years ago to ESPN. I mean, I'm 46, so we grew up, and You Can't Touch This was number one when I was in high school.
Yeah. And
he was the biggest star in the world in 1990. He came about 10 years ago, and it was just him, dressed to the nine. I mean, he had his $1 million suit on. Super nice guy. We talked about matters of faith, and got him on a couple shows, and just had a good time with him. I've gotten to meet a lot of interesting people, sports. I mean, I remember walking through the hallways and seeing LeBron James, in his uniform, sitting in the King James chair that he's on the Sports Center commercial with Scott Van Pelt, because he was filming that commercial that day. And I just happened to
Wow.
walk through while I was going to the cafeteria. I remember walking through the hallways and seeing Snoop Dogg. And why is Snoop Dogg here? And then you realize, oh, he's here because he's promoting something. So you meet different people. Some days are crazier than others. And, I was blessed to be able to be there.
It's got to be surreal. I remember, MC Hammer sang the famous gospel song, "You got to pray just to make it today." So that's a Christian right there.
There it is. Yeah. Well, he used to tell me, I said, how do you work your faith into your songs? And I wasn't even thinking when I asked that. And he goes, you mean other than pray? And I said, yeah. He goes, well, look at, you can't touch this. My music's, what is it? My music takes me so far, helps me say, oh my Lord, thank you for blessing me. Like, I'm like, oh, he actually worked faith into one of
It's
the most
there.
famous songs ever. It's there. So we had a really neat conversation about faith. It was fun.
That's funny. What about favorite sports teams of yours?
Dallas Cowboys in the NFL. That's been since 1979. New York Mets in baseball since 1983 because of Darryl Strawberry and then eventually Dwight Gooden. And Boston Celtics since probably 1980 or 81. My dad's a Celtics fan. It's the only team that I kind of aligned with him on. And Larry Bird, once he came in the league, became my sports hero, him and Darryl Strawberry in the 80s.
Yeah.
So those are teams that I rooted for as a kid. And here we are now. I'm not a kid anymore, and I still root for them. I still live and die.
That's Die Hard right there.
Mostly die.
Yeah. I'm a Cowboys fan through marriage, I like to say. In-law. Cowboy in-law fan.
Dallas hasn't won anything in 25 years. So people say, oh, you're a bandwagon. I'm like, well, maybe in the 90s they were winning a lot. I was a fan of the 80s when they weren't good. Then in the 90s they won, and then they haven't won anything since. So it's hard to call me a bandwagon fan, but yeah, it'd be nice if they could actually win another Super Bowl someday.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So I want to jump to the questions I ask all my guests as a time about discernment, time you made a decision that you had the influence of God or the Bible or relationships around you, and a time that you had godly discernment, what that decision was, and then maybe one that you did not have discernment, and then what you maybe learned from it.
Okay. Well, the time I did not have godly discernment, I mean, I wasn't a Christian for 27 years, so there's tons of discernment, if you will, that didn't involve the Lord, but decisions that I made that I still believe the Lord directed my steps and took me to where I needed to get to. Even just getting to ESPN was a crazy story on how that happened. So, but discerning, I think after I became a Christian, still not kind of seeking the Lord, or not even necessarily seeking the Lord, but not kind of having God guide my steps, was during my time at ESPN. It was about 2008. So I was probably 8 years into my journey at ESPN. And I had been a Christian for 5-6 years, but for that time frame, I think my Christian journey was more focused on Sundays and occasionally a little bit on, I don't know, Wednesdays or Tuesdays when I'd have a small group setting or something.
Yeah.
But for the most part, my journey with Christ was pretty much separated from my time as an ESPN producer. So I would go to work and kind of ESPN was over here. There's a piece of my life, my marriage, my relationship with my daughter over here, a piece of my life. And then ESPN was a large piece of my life. And in many ways, even after becoming a Christian, ESPN in many ways was my God,
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I hate admitting that, but it's true. I mean, it's the honest truth. And so in 2008, I was going through this process of trying to get promoted and really chasing the next job, corporate ladder, striving for achievement, striving for success. And about, I think it was April or May of 2008, ESPN, what they do when you work there is they provide you with mid-year reviews and year-end reviews. That's common in most businesses. And at ESPN in April, May, you get a mid-year review. And in October, November, you get a year-end review. And that's your final review. They sometimes give you a little raise, maybe a bonus. And in 2008, I got a scathing mid-year review. And it came out of nowhere. And it read something like this. It said, Jason is clearly talented, but he is losing focus in the task at hand. He is so focused on himself and getting promoted that he's not doing a job right where he's at.
Mm.
And I was like, ooh, okay, this came out of nowhere. But what that did was that really opened up my eyes to the idea of the discernment. I was trying to chase the corporate ladder at
Yeah.
ESPN, and I wasn't looking at it through the lens of Christ.
Mm.
See, God was a piece of my life at that time, but he was not the centerpiece. And
Wow.
so when he is the centerpiece of my life, my eyes should be focused on him and then others and then myself.
That's
During
good.
this time in 2008, I was so focused on me and my achievement and my success that I missed on who God was, number one, but also that I was to be present in the moment where I was with the team I was working with. So I was trying to get this next job, but I wasn't being great or excellent. I prefer that second word, excellent,
Yeah.
in the job that I was currently in. And that was not representing God well, and that was letting my teammates down.
Mm.
So the discernment there was not good discernment because it wasn't being seen through the lens of who Christ is. A time that I did use godly discernment, I would say this is probably the easiest answer for me, because when I left ESPN, I sought wise counsel and I sought the wisest counsel with God.
Mm.
And because it didn't make sense. It just made no sense. And I remember it was 2015 when I never heard an audible voice, but I felt like God was saying, I want you to do more for me. Don't
Mm.
forget that. I want you to do more for me. And I didn't know what that meant, and I knew that it didn't, my salvation wasn't predicated on doing more for God.
Right.
I just knew that, we should be spurned to good works, right? It says our salvation should lead us to want to be a good person and to do good works for others.
Right.
It doesn't get us in heaven, but it certainly should be a part of the fruit of the Spirit that comes out of us after we begin that relationship. And so I felt like God was saying, I want you to do more for me. I want you to do more for me. I didn't know what that meant, but at the end of 2015, I was having probably the roughest patch of my time at ESPN. Just, I liked my job, but the people I was around, I wasn't clicking with. Had a difficult boss. For me, he's a great guy and a really good dude, but just me and him weren't clicking
Yeah.
with regards to work. And it was easy for me to want to be out. It's time to go. I'm ready to look for a new job. Hey, God's telling me to do more for him, and I'm not enjoying what I'm doing. Let's bolt. Let's go.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people do that. They think the grass is greener, and when the going gets tough, well, I'm out. I'm bailing, and I'm going to go find something else.
Right.
And I remember getting this connection for this potential opportunity to leave ESPN to go work for a sports ministry. And it was interesting because I thought that was God clearly saying, I want you to do more for me. I remember going to my wife and saying, this opportunity might come. It hadn't been presented yet, but it might come. And if it does, I want to go and I want to move and I want to get out and let's just go. My wife was like, slow your roll, dude. You're not going anywhere. We're in Connecticut because of ESPN. Why would you want to leave this place? This doesn't make any sense. And I said, no, God is saying he wants me to do more for him. And this is sports ministry, which has a faith, centered element to it with sports. It's perfect. Let's go. And my wife was like, no, it's not time. And I could sense that she was thinking about it from her faith perspective too. And just like, I don't have peace in this, this at all.
Yeah.
And so she was great about that. And we spent some time in prayer with that. And, obviously discernment there from my wife was like, all right, let's press pause here.
Yeah.
Let's not cancel it. Let's just press pause. 2016 comes in. It's the best year I ever had at ESPN. I get to go work on Mike and Mike. I get to go travel across the country, go to amazing sporting events, have an incredible 12 months working on Mike and Mike. Popular show, a lot of people watching it. Just a ton of fun.
Yeah. I used to watch it.
I'm at my favorite time at ESPN at this point, literally going from my least favorite to my most favorite time. And yet I still felt this stirring in my spirit. Like, don't forget, Jason, I still want you to do more for me.
Yeah.
And so what I did was I spent 2016 intentionally building relationships with people outside of ESPN. Phone calls, conversations, emails, texts, people who were pastors, people who were writers, authors, speakers, anyone outside, really not even in the broadcasting world,
Mm.
but outside of ESPN that I could just learn from.
Right.
And I was thinking if I did this, God would kind of make it clear if I was supposed to leave or not and what that do more for me is. And in a lot of time in prayer with that, doors opened on two levels. One was to write a book, which actually happened before I ever left ESPN. The idea to write a book came about. The contract to write a book was signed in September of 2016, and I was still at ESPN. So this writing a book thing happened, and I was like, wait a minute, God, why are you, this is part of doing more for me, but I don't want to write a book. I have no interest. And by the way, the book is a deep, very personal, real raw story of me and my relationship with my alcoholic father. So what are you doing? Like, why would I want to write a book on that?
Yeah.
But the door kept opening and I kept hearing, yes, yes. So I pursued that. A month or two later, I get a call from the same person that I talked to about sports ministry earlier. And this person, his name is Steve. He said, Jason, we just purchased and acquired Sports Spectrum. Have you heard of it? I said, yeah, I have actually. It's Sports and Faith. It's like a media company. He said, yeah. He's like, so remember when we were talking about potentially coming to work with sports ministry? Well, I have an opportunity here that I think could be perfect for you. It's media, sports media, but through the lens of Christ, telling sports stories of faith. We want you to come and basically run Sports Spectrum and oversee it, kind of build it up from the ground and create more content, including a podcast that you would host and produce. So I stopped him for a second. I said, I haven't hosted anything in 20 years. Are you sure you got the right guy? They said, yeah. We know you produce shows and you've been around some of the best hosts, so we believe you know how to host. So we think you could do this. What do you think? And I said, well, let me pray about it. Let me talk to my wife about it. And, let's talk about what that actual offer would look like. So we prayed, and my wife was still a little uncertain. But the discernment here, and I know it's a long-winded story, Tim, but I really think it's an important one.
This is great.
The discernment here was not just bolting when things were bad. See, at this time, things were great. So it made no sense to leave ESPN.
Right.
And yet I knew God was calling me away. And so I prayed about it. I talked to my wife about it. We prayed about it. And then they made the offer. And then we sat down and we said, okay, can this work? Because the offer, being honest, 40% pay cut, contract job, no benefits, working from home and traveling to Denver once a month. So it was a different change from the basically 5 day a week going into the office. It's 15 minutes away.
Yeah.
And you lost 40% of your money.
Right.
And my wife wasn't liking that at all. But I said, listen, let me ask you something. Can we live on what they're offering? And we made, did the budget and looked at it. I said, we can, because I was making what they're offering 5 years earlier or whatever. So I know we can live off it. And I said, here's what I want you to understand here. I said, I believe this is from God. If it's not, and it's Jason's feelings, this will blow up in my face.
Right.
The door will shut. It'll mess up. It'll be a disaster. It might be okay for a little while, but if it's not from God, it's just not it's going to fail quickly. However, if it is from God, which I believe it is, I think the doors will swing wide open. I think there'll be opportunities. I think God will provide. I still believe that whatever we do, but I said he will provide, and opportunities will come that we least expect, and God will, like I said, see it through. And 3.5 years later, I can tell you, Tim, God saw it through. We wrote not one book, but 2 books.
Yeah.
The opportunity to do this podcast has been amazing. We've now got 5 sponsors for our show. We have 2 million downloads of the podcast. It's growing and growing, and it still continues to grow. I love what we get to do. Love that I get to interview and talk to and meet so many amazing people. And I can look back now, because I really don't think you can ever know God's true plan for your life until you look back.
Yeah.
It's really stepping out in faith, trusting him, and then, walking through that process, directing the steps as God would ordain them to. But it's when you look back and you can say, okay, I clearly see what God meant when he said, in all your ways acknowledge me and I will make your path straight.
Wow. Yeah.
That's what's happened with me in the last 3.5 years. God's made this crazy, what looks like a really winding up and down path as straight as could be. And it's clearly all from him. So,
wow. That's so good, and there's so much in there to dig into. And a few things come to mind is first of all, our wives are a great source of discernment. If you have a wife, rely on her. Or if you
Absolutely.
have a husband, you're supposed to be called to be one unit, one soul. And so don't try to do things on your own if you are married. The other thing I would say is that a lot of times God will spur things in you that it's not the right time for, but he's preparing you. And I've seen this in my own life where it's small things. And I call it, you called it open door too. I've called it the open door analogy with God, where God will open a door and we don't know what's on the other side of it, but it's a step of faith to walk through. And it can
Yes.
seem scary. It can seem like, I don't know what's going to be on the other side. But if you trust that it's a door that God opened, then like you said, he will sustain you. He will carry you through. And then on the other side, you can look back and say, wow, I am so glad that I walked through not just that door, but multiple doors along the way. But at the same time, God opens doors and it's our decision to walk through. And there's nothing that we can stay where we're at. We can stay in our comfort zone. God might open it up again down the road. So there's grace for us if we don't walk through them, but there's also blessing if we do. There's blessing if God opens a door, then understand he will carry you through it. And there's been a lot of similar things in my life with that too.
It's a great way to put it, Tim. And I've seen people say, I'm afraid to go, number one. So I understand that. And the fear is a real thing. I had fear too. Uh, but I would say also that it's not just the fear, but it's being okay if it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And that was what I had to come to when I said to my wife, listen, if it doesn't work, I'll find another job. I have enough experience or whatever. I trust that God will provide. So if it doesn't work or this is not from God, let him make it clear. So, because I don't want to do anything that's not from God.
Yeah.
And so let him make it clear. And if it doesn't work out, that's okay. And I think that's the part that people are afraid of
Mm-hmm.
is what if it doesn't work out? Like, I'm going
Right.
to put all my eggs in this basket. And if it doesn't work out, I'm done. And it's like, no, it's okay if it doesn't work out. Because if it doesn't work out, then that's what God wanted to. And I'm speaking from a faith perspective
Yeah.
here. For those listening who might not be Christians, like, I understand, it's if this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But for me, I was so okay with it not working out that it was worth me trying to see if it does work out. Because I felt like it's the leap of faith thing, right? Like, you take a leap of faith. If it doesn't work out, you felt good that you tried. But if it does work out, holy cow, if it's from God,
Yeah.
it'll be beyond my wildest imaginations. And that's what's really happened here. I'm living in a world of sports, faith, broadcasting, all of the passions that I had, the dreams that I had when I was 20 are coming true at 45,
Wow.
not at 30 or 28 or 22 or 26 or whatever. They're coming together now. And it's okay to enjoy the journey also and let
Yeah.
this kind of thing play out.
I want to go back a second because I love the video that's on your website. I would encourage everyone to look at it, or I'll try to put it in the show notes if I can. But it's about your whole journey, and you talk in there about a conversation you had with Tony Dungy's assistant, who encouraged you to bloom where you're planted. Because I think at the time, you can correct me if I'm wrong, you wanted to get out of ESPN, you wanted to get into ministry or something related, and she told you you can stay here and do the work you're wanting to do at ESPN. And when the time was right, you were able to leave. But I think a lot of people need to hear that God might be putting on you a vision, but it's okay to be faithful where you're at if God's not calling you to move yet. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, that was a pivotal moment in my life. It changed my life really that day when Coach Dungy was at ESPN, and it's his assistant Jessica that actually said, "Bloom where you're planted." Use the words "bloom where you're planted." But for me, it was one of those where at that time I wasn't necessarily looking to leave ESPN, but I felt like if I was supposed to go into ministry or do something that was ministry related, that I had to leave ESPN. I
Mm,
didn't understand that my work at ESPN could actually be my ministry.
right.
I didn't understand that until Coach Dungy comes and his
Mm,
assistant Jessica, and they both say this wonderful, Coach Dungy asked me the question, how do you live out your faith here at ESPN? Because he found out I was a Christian. Jessica, his assistant, steps in when I say, I don't know how to do that. I think I have to leave if I need to do that. And Jessica says, no, no, no. You're to bloom where you're planted, because look where you are. Look at the ministry field that you have at ESPN. Look how you can be a light to so many other people. Look how you can truly be a representative of Christ right where you are.
Yeah.
She said it. She said, God might call you away someday. Obviously, he did. She said, God might call you away someday, but until he does, understand that he's got you here for a purpose. So bloom.
Yeah.
And it changed my life. Honestly, Tim, it made me think and focus on the future. I mean, not focus on the future and just focus on the present. And I went that day from being a ESPN producer who happened to be a Christian to being a follower of Christ who happened to be an ESPN producer.
Wow.
Order is important.
Yeah.
For many of us, we are the baseball player or the construction worker or the, even the pastor who happens to be a Christian.
Yeah.
But when we get it right, and I mentioned it earlier about God being the centerpiece, we are Christians everywhere we go.
Right.
So I was a Christian going to ESPN. I was a Christian going home to be a dad to my daughter. I was a Christian going to church, going to the grocery store, going to get gas, going to a sporting event, whatever it was. My identity was found in me being a Christian, is found in Christ, not in what I did.
Yeah.
So that day really focused me a little bit. It took a little while, but really helped me focus that, okay, you're a Christian first who happens to work at ESPN, who happens to be a dad and a husband. You are not an ESPN producer first who happens to be a Christian. This is an identity issue, Tim, that so many, especially athletes, have.
Yeah.
That they are baseball players who happen to be Christian.
Right.
They are football players who happen to be Christian. No, they are Christians who happen to be baseball players, who happen to be football players. And again,
when they
the
get
order
injured or
is
something
important.
and then it's gone, then they don't have identity anymore.
Exactly. And so if they're rooted in this, and Paul says, on the solid rock of Christ do I stand.
Right.
And you heard the song, all other ground is sinking sand. And that's the truth.
Yeah.
Because if we root ourselves in Christ, it's the solid rock. It's unshakable. And our foundation is firm in that. When we root it in sports, or we root it in our family, or we root it in our job, or we root it in other people, or anything of this world, it sinks.
Right.
And it's fleeting and it won't last. And that really was a game changer for me that day with Coach Dungy.
I pray this encourages someone listening. You might think that I'm not where I need to be. God's calling me to do more. I can't be successful where I'm at as a Christian, but no, you can bloom where you're planted now. You can have that life of faith that is attractive to others, whether you're a stay-at-home mom, whether you're working fast food, whether you're in school. Like, all these are parts of the journey. Like you said, the journey, the process to get there is just as important as getting there, because God will use those moments, those even the bad parts of the process to grow us. People that look at, if someone wants to be a pastor, well, I want to be like that person that has 1 million followers, that has a huge following, that's an influencer. Well, you don't know that person's journey. You don't know what it took for them to get there, the churches that they had to go through, the process they had to go through, the struggles to get there. And so everyone's journey is a little bit different, but we have to make sure that we trust God along the way and not just want the results, because God's timetable is way different than our own.
Completely agree. And it's funny because we want to control, we live in a microwavable society, a controllable society. And really God says, no, actually let go of control. Let me handle this. I got you. And, when we do that, and at least in my life and my journey, that's when I felt like I've experienced the most joy. And so I could not agree more.
Really good. Well, we could talk about that for another hour, but I want to move on to your books. First of all, Live to Forgive. In it, you say the only route to freedom and peace is forgiveness. And you talked about this briefly, about your journey with forgiving your dad. Just talk more about this book and why you wrote it, and the importance of forgiveness in your life and in the life of the Christian.
Well, let's start with the life of a Christian. Forgiveness is not optional. And it's not my words, that's Jesus's words.
Right.
If you go into Matthew 18 and you read the parable of the unforgiving debtor, or you go into Ephesians 4 or so many other places in God's word, you see that we are to forgive every single time we are wronged. In Matthew 18, Jesus says 70 times 7. And he's not talking about 490. He's talking about every single time. And he tells that to Peter. And so when we think about forgiveness from a Christian perspective, it's non-negotiable. Now, that doesn't mean we screw that up, because, full disclosure, I've screwed that up many times.
Yeah.
But it at least gives us a guide to understand that it's not optional. It's required to be a Christian, is to forgive. From my own perspective, like I said, I became a Christian in 2001. My dad and I had a very confusing, difficult relationship for close to 40 years. He's an alcoholic. He suffered from depression later in life, and could not kick the bottle. And his alcoholism led to a very strained, broken relationship with his 3 sons, me and my 2 brothers. Led to 2 divorces. Led to the loss of his job, DUIs, jail time, a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah.
And he tried. He really did, and he fought. My dad's a fighter, and he didn't know how to love properly. He was always dependent on something, from someone else, or something that he was trying to do to earn love. It's very much like a relationship with God in some ways. And that's not how it works. And he, through that, he was a very angry drunk, and his anger would lead to a lot of words and things that he said that he regrets, but there were still words that come from your dad.
Yeah.
And so he would call me some pretty horrible, terrible things when I'd fight back with him. He would call my family, and all of us, really, my brothers had the same experience, awful things you would never wish on your worst enemy or say on your worst enemy. So that's where I really built up a ton of bitterness in my life towards him. And, I talk about in the book, boxes in the attic. I had built up all these memories, these bad memories, and kind of festered them and stored them in a box and put them up in the attic of my brain and tried to forget them. And unfortunately, just like in a real box that's in the attic, eventually you have to pull the box out and see what's inside of it.
Yeah.
And for me, I would revisit that occasionally, especially as I became a Christian, to understand and try to see who my dad was and what this relationship could be. And it's funny, what I was doing towards my dad, I felt like I was justified. He was causing this pain to me, so I would lash out back at him, and I would say things to him that I'm not proud of. And I thought I was justified in saying that because of what he did to me. And that's the wrong way to go about it, but that's kind of what I thought. And what that did was that led to me being wrapped up in these chains of bitterness that took me a long time to get out of. I always tell people, forgiveness is not about the other person. It's not predicated on what the other person does. It's not, waiting for that person to apologize. Forgiveness is for ourselves.
Yeah.
Somebody said it once. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover the prisoner is me.
Wow. It's good.
I forget who said that. Lewis Smedes, I think, is the name of the theologian. To forgive is to set a prisoner free and discover the prisoner is me. That's what I was living for so many years. So I've discovered that forgiveness is the great game changer in life. I really believe that, because when we truly are coming to a place where we can forgive someone, and I was able to do that with my dad, I think what it does is it frees us from having bitterness and anger towards other people. Now, that does not let the other person off the hook.
Sure.
That's what we think happens when we forgive is, oh, we've just justified that person's wrongdoing. That's not the case. Again, forgiveness is not about the other person. If justice needs to be served, it'll be served. It'll be taken care of. And sometimes you got to build boundaries, because if a person's really, truly hurting you and doing things terribly to you, you got to build boundaries up there and get away from that.
Sure.
But that doesn't mean you can't forgive them. Especially if you're a follower of Christ, you're commanded to forgive. But that forgiveness is for your own benefit. It allows you to live a free life in Christ. It really does. Yeah. And it's predicated, when we think about forgiveness, like that is the essence of our relationship with Christ.
Yeah.
We come to him every day and say, listen, I screwed up again. Even initially when you start that relationship, God, forgive me because I'm a sinner and I'm screwed up and I'm a mess and I need you. So the forgiveness is really at the core of who we are as followers of Christ. But we're also supposed to be Christ-like in the way that we exude ourselves. And so if we go about our lives asking for forgiveness from God, but then not forgiving others, then we're just living a life of that's as a hypocrite.
Yeah.
And that's not what Christ wants us to do. I think he wants us to emulate him as much as possible in the way that we live. That's why the fruit of the Spirit that Paul talks about in Galatians is so important, because that should be what we exude as followers of Christ. And in that fruit of the Spirit, one of them is forgiveness. And so I think forgiveness is such an important thing. It's probably why I wrote the book, because it's one thing to just tell my story and you can hear it and be like, wow, that's an powerful story or whatever. But how can that apply to your life? And so we wrote this book not just to tell my story, but to have it be applicable into your life so that you can be challenged and say, you know what, I need to really search inside and look at the forgiveness that I need to maybe extend to someone else who's wronged me.
Yeah.
And so that's why we wrote it.
That's great. And like you said, we're reminded of the debt we could never pay that Jesus forgave from us. And so he even told the parable of the king that forgave his servant of a huge debt. He was going to go to prison. And then the servant was so, wanted to pay. I read it in the Message Bible recently to my son. It was like $10 compared to $100,000 is how they put it. And for the $10, he, grabbed the servant by the neck and shook him. And then the king was like, "What are you doing? I forgave you $100,000 and you can't even forgive your fellow servant." So
that's it, man. Yeah, that's
awesome.
The parable of the unforgiving debtor in Matthew 18. And it's the perfect example of who we are as Christians sometimes, the flawed Christians that we all are, that we can ask you, God, to forgive us of our debt, the 10,000, but then we can't turn around and say, Dad, to my father, I forgive you, which is in essence, when you look at the grand scheme of things, a $10 debt. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. But once you get it, I think people understand, man, that weight, it's just freeing. It really is. And it helps you not be kind of kept in this bitterness and bondage that we all get stuck in when we don't forgive.
Awesome. Well, I want to make sure we get to Uniform of Leadership, your latest book. Tell everyone real quick what that is, why servant leadership is so important to Christians.
It's so important. I mean, honestly, I don't think you can be a leader if you're not serving, just being honest. I think you could be a boss or you could be in control and have like a certain title or status, but the best leaders are those who serve. The only leaders, in my opinion, are those who serve. And, I don't even think there's a definition of a bad leader. I just think if you don't serve, you're not a leader. And, I think that for me in the past, 5 years, I've been devouring leadership books and really interested in learning more about leadership. And I always wanted to write a book about my experiences at ESPN. I wanted it to be positive. I didn't want to be a peel back behind the curtain to all the negativity that can go on in a place like ESPN. I wanted it to be fun and entertaining stories, but then I really wanted to focus on the aspect of leadership. And every single story that's in the book, The Uniform of Leadership, is really told intentionally to help people understand how they can become better leaders. And so I tell stories of Tony Dungy, what you mentioned, and that story's in there. And, the leadership lesson that we can all, take with us is blooming where we're planted, right? Yeah. And then there's stories from people like Drew Brees and people like Dale Earnhardt Jr., Jenny Finch, the softball player. And then there's people that you haven't heard of before. And all of these stories of my time at ESPN are cobbled together to show you how Jesus led and how we can understand as leaders to lead like Christ. To think about Matthew 20:28, where Jesus says, I did not come, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. He's the greatest leader of all time. And so if I want to emulate Jesus, the greatest leader, I need to serve because that's what he did. Right. And so that's why we wrote the book, and that's really what it's centered around.
That sounds amazing. Yeah, definitely. I'll put that in the show notes. But that's going to do it for our time, Jason. Thank you so much for being on. Go ahead and let everyone know where they can find you and connect with you.
Yeah, my website is jasonromano.com, just my name. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram pretty frequently, and my DMs are open and love to connect and hear from anybody who wants to say hello or reach out for anything else. So yeah, love to hear from you.
Very cool. Everyone check that out. Grab those books. They sound amazing. I'm going to read them myself. And once again, thanks for coming on. God bless you and your ministry, sir.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. God bless you.
Thank you for listening to the Everyday Discernment Podcast. For more information on Discerning Dad, go to discerning-dad.com. Be sure to follow on all the social media platforms. Just search for Discerning Dad. Please share this podcast with a friend and leave an honest review on whichever platform you listen. Feel free to send any comments, suggestions, questions, or prayer requests at discerningdad@outlook.com. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.